What's up, guys? I wanted to make a video today about the dangers of EQ. So we've talked a little bit about it, right? High pass filters, what, EQ does as far as phase shifting. That's kind of how EQs work. But I wanted to make a video that was a little bit more visual to show you what's happening with some of these moves that we make with our EQs. So the way that I have this set up today is I have a EQ curve analyzer as well as Kirchhoff EQ in here, and we have this set to minimal phase right now, or minimum phase, right? So it is going to be a zero latency EQ. You will usually see minimum phase EQs in most digital EQs, but as well as analog EQs or analog emulations are, minimum phase EQs. And then I'll show you the difference between that and a linear phase EQ. But just to go over some of the basics and some of the ways that we can kind of unintentionally damage our audio with EQing, and just knowing what's going on when you use an EQ and how we can mitigate some of those issues, right? So the way an EQ normally works is that when we actually make cuts or boosts with the EQ nodes, we cause some inherent phase shifting. That's just the way EQs work, right? So not all phase shifting is bad, though. I just want to set this, set the standard here right off the gate. When we hear phase shifting, a lot of people, and purists get very, wary of phase shifting, right? But the thing is, phase shifting, especially the way our ear hears it as well, is often very musical. It's like this smooth kind of smearing of the frequency space. And that can actually help us in the mixing phase create a good sense of gestalt and blend between our sounds. But I would say there's a few different use cases when we don't want that phase shifting to happen. So without further ado, let's kind of get into it. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to create a node with my EQ. So just remember let me actually turn on my cursor here. But here I got my EQ, and here we have the representation of the band, and we're also going to see the phase shift that is happening, right? Because this is analyzing my EQ curves. So what we'll do is we'll first start off with a high pass. So we often hear, high pass the low end on a master or on, low end instruments or things that don't need the low end, right? And so that sometimes is the right move, but sometimes it isn't the right move, right? Let's just see what happens when we create a high pass. So our green band here is going to be our actual filter, and the pink band here is going to be the actual phase alignment. So what we're going to do here is we're going to create kind of just a normal slope that you'll see on a high pass, like 30 dBs per octave on the slope there. And we're going to pull that up to about 30 hertz, right? So if you look here, right, this is kind of the danger of minimum phase with high pass. When we use high pass, we can end up getting these very, very sharp phase shifts, right? What this does is this affects the center frequency. So, right at or a little bit above the center frequency, which we have about 30 hertz here, we're getting some crazy phase shifting here. Now, this isn't always a problem, but a lot of the time what this can end up doing is causing phase distortion, or it can cause like spikes in audio that you might not be intending for, right? You might be trying to cut some of this, and actually you're boosting some of those problems that are happening there, right? So it's very important that we understand when we high pass anything, we are causing this phase shift that is happening at that center frequency and below, right? It's very important to know that. That's why you'll often hear me say that rather than high pass, in some cases, I love using a low shelf, which is a little bit different, right? So this is the high pass, right? And let's see what happens when we change this to a low shelf band here. So let's change this to a low shelf, and let's pull this down, right? So essentially what we're doing is we're attenuating those frequencies below that node. So all the frequencies below the node, right? The node is here. All the frequencies below the node are getting attenuated, and we are only causing minimum phase shift, right? So there is more of a gradual slight curve than if we were to have, again, that high pass filter where we have this giant shift in that phase. So again, what I like to do, again, if I'm wanting to do something like cut some of the lows from my master, a mix, or basses, or especially any multi-mic sources, which we'll get into exactly when we will probably want to use a low shelf or a linear phase EQ. But in this sense, right, I probably, if I'm wanting to achieve, an attenuation in the lower range, a lot of the times I opt for the low shelf, because the low shelf is going to be a little bit more gradual, and especially on stuff like bass, 808s, kicks, or anything that's layered together in this low range, I tend to use the shelf, especially also on the high end too. It's kind of the same thing. So if I create a band here and I do a low pass filter, let's pull that down. We also get some really crazy phase shifting that's happening there, right? So again, with these filters, we really want to be very aware of what we're doing here with our EQ moves. It's not to say that we don't use high pass or low pass on, minimum phase EQs, but it's something that we have to kind of be aware of when we're doing this, right? The more drastic these slopes are, the more margin for phase shift, right? The more gradual these are, the less aggressive that phase shift actually is, right? So again, if I switch this low pass to a high shelf now, and I gain that down or gain that up, we see a way more gradual phase shift there. So again, I like to use these, shelving filters because they're a lot more transparent and they're a lot less damaging than something like a high pass filter, especially when you're thinking in terms of, doing a EQ move like this on a mix bus, a stereo bus, anything that's layered. So coming back to that, right, I would argue that it's really important that, we use something like linear phase if we want to work on signals that are layered together or that are existing primarily in this range. Now, we don't always want to use a linear Q for every little thing, right? Because linear phase EQs can also introduce something, called pre-ringing, which obviously is its own problem. But what it's really good at is not affecting this phase and causing these phase shifts. Why this is so important, again, is like, for instance, say if we had parallel signals, right? It's the same signal, but it's a copy of it. If we EQ one of them with a high pass filter, let's say, and the other one doesn't have that high pass filter, well, we've caused some phase shifting happening. And in this zone, what could tend to happen, especially if we have that aggressive high pass filter there, and let's kind of pull this back. Let's just get rid of this low shelf. But what can tend to happen is if we high pass one of the signals, we can end up getting some phase shifting here that can cause some incoherences. It can cause some phase cancellation, actually, right? So we can get, opportunities where our signals actually cancel out, like our bass might cancel out, our kicks might cancel out, anything in this range might cancel out. So if we're ever doing anything with parallel signaling, it's way better to use linear phase. So if I use linear phase here, and actually you're seeing all this crazy stuff here, but it's only because we've added now latency. If I actually compensate for the latency here, you can kind of see that with this EQ now, we're not getting this crazy phase shift that's happening at the actual center frequency. We're getting some movement here, right, below the actual center frequency of the node, but that's okay because we're actually cutting and attenuating these frequencies. We don't hear that shift, right? But we're not having the same problem at our actual center frequency, right? So as I move this up, we actually don't get that same issue that we're running into at the center frequency, which can cause that phase shift there. It's causing it in the inaudible portion of the audio, which is totally fine, right? That's what we want in most cases. especially when we're, again, either layering signals together. So they're occupying the same frequencies and they're being layered on top of each other. So think of like, you know, kicks that you're layering together, snares that you're layering together with another sound, and you're blending these layers together, or when you're doing like bass production where you have multiple basses stacked on top of each other, right? We can really run into some issues if, you know, you're high passing one of the basses with a, you know, a minimal phase EQ and the other one you're kind of leaving normal. Well, again, we can get some problems at that center frequency if we have a minimum phase EQ, right? And let's compensate for that latency. And again, we have that center point frequency where we're getting most of that shift happening, right? This is also very important when you're using multi-mic sources. So when you have, you know, a case where you are recording multiple drums, right, in the same room or something like that, you definitely want to make sure that you have linear phase EQ when you are doing something like a high pass or these aggressive kind of notches that can create these problems, because this will give us the best opportunity for phase alignment, right, and phase coherence. So when we're in linear phase, again, let's compensate for that latency there, but now we do not have that same issue at that point. So that's set to be said about high passes and low passes, right? When we are aggressively cutting these frequencies, sometimes it's best to use linear phase. And again, if you are doing it in a context where, you know, it doesn't really matter too much because you're not working with some of those use cases that we talked about, like you know, lining up layers or working with parallel buses, or in a mastering case where, you know, phase alignment is really key, you don't have to worry too much about this, right? It's not like a, you know, a rule of thumb, but it's just here. I'm just here to show you the math behind it, right? So when we use that minimum phase EQ, let's adjust for the latency. Again, we get that phase shifting problem. Another time that we can actually get some phase shifting, major phase shifting happening is, I'm going to delete this node real quick, but another way that we can actually get that is if I create a node here and I actually make this node very sharp as a Q, and let's cut here. So you'll often see this when you're trying to cut out some resonances, right? Let's say you find like a resonance in the actual track, master, vocal, whatever it is, and you're trying to cut that out. The tighter that you move that Q, you can kind of see how and what happens to that phase shift. So as we tighten that, we can kind of see how that starts to get exaggerated and be almost a little bit more drastic, right? So this is something to be said about, again, in minimum phase, using these very sharp filters for, you know, detecting resonances and kind of pulling those out. Sometimes it's actually best to not go so narrow in a minimum phase EQ. So again, for instance, let's come to this side of the EQ here, and I make that same kind of cut here, but let's do it a lot less narrow here, right? We can still go pretty narrow, but let's go less needle-like. What you can see here is we're still getting some phase shifting here, right? But it's not anything as drastic as we're seeing with these very narrow bands. So that's just something that you want to be aware of too. The more drastic the Q, right? The tighter the Q value and the more drastic the cut, right? If we gain this even more down, the more drastic the actual phase shift is happening there, right? And again, this can cause problems with those areas of the frequency range that we're trying to have these gestalts. So say the low end, you have a lot of instruments in your low mids, you have a lot of instruments in your mid range, right? So doing this can kind of throw off that gestalt there, right? So sometimes, again, if we're doing these very, very narrow cuts, sometimes it's better to use linear phase for these types of moves. Again, let's compensate for the latency there. But now we have this linear phase band here with this really tight Q. And we're actually getting no shifting there that's happening, right? So again, this is here to show you that when we go narrow with our Qs, sometimes it's way better to use linear phase um, just to make sure that we're not actually causing any more issues here, right? So now that I've put that in a more high quality linear phase mode, we can actually see that represented the same kind of shape as our cue here, right? So it's a really tight cue, but we're not getting actually any phase shifting. We're actually just removing that frequency in general. So that's, again, to be said, if we go to minimum phase here, right, now we still get that phase shift. So kind of good to understand, okay, if I ever want to pull out some resonances or go a little bit more aggressive with the cue actual, tightness there and make it a very resonant filter there, we are really going to have to think about that, right? As far as like what this is doing to our actual audio. Now, again, I don't want this to be something that you really like freak out about, but I just am showing you this for the pure educational fact of what you're actually doing to the sound with EQ. So again, what I can do here is with this band, I'm going to actually pull this down. We're going to have like kind of a broader band here. Then we're going to have a little bit of a tighter band here. And then we're going to have a little bit more of a narrow band here. Let's pull this EQ down here so you can kind of see this. So you can see how the different shapes of the filters, this is more broad and less aggressive. This is a little bit more aggressive. And this is super, super aggressive here, right? Where we have that kind of needle-like filter. And you're seeing how these are directly proportionate to the phase shift that's happening, right? So again, just you want to be aware of that when we use these EQs. Now, this is a digital EQ, right? This is the Kirchhoff EQ. So you can, go really tight with these bands or, go as really broad as you want to, right? And you can kind of see how that's affecting the actual, both the frequency and the phase. But let's actually put something else on here. So let's go, instead of the Kirchhoff here, let's put something like the SSL channel strip, right? So we can use like an emulation of an analog EQ here. So we have this EQ here. And so now what we can do is, let's just do this. There we go. And now we're a clean slate here. So again, let's say we want to boost some of our mid-range. This is really cool because we can actually see the filter shape as well. So there's the filter. This is the cue. So let me put the cue as tight as it goes there. And we can kind of see how that analog EQ is also affecting the phase. And I'll put these kind of bands in different areas of the frequency space as well as the cue values here. There we go. And let's move this one a little bit more down. So you can see with an analog EQ, it's a little less aggressive, right? Because even at our tightest Q values, we're not getting a lot of those crazy shifts. And again, that's why these EQs are actually sought after, right? Because the way that these EQs work, especially with their circuits, they create a very musical sounding gestalt. And that's what I was saying earlier. Phase shift isn't always bad. It's actually what gives it each of the EQs kind of their own characteristic. We can get a subtle sweetening or like a smearing that causes this very nice blend of the sounds. So that's why these are very sought after. But again, it's just to show you that even these analog EQs are having that phase shift. So again, don't get so worried about shifting the phase. It's not like you can avoid it and you should always use linear phase, right? Because inherently how an EQ works is with phase shift. You need the phase shift to actually give you a great sense of the sound that you're actually carving or shaping with EQ itself. So also, I want to show you when we use the high pass and the low pass, right? So let's use the high pass here. But you can see even with the analog EQ here, and let's actually remove the cuts here, or the boost at these bands here, just so you can kind of just see the high pass filter. So the high pass filter, again, as we move that up, we are getting that same phase shift that we saw with the Kirchhoff EQ. So it's just to say, again, that we can't kind of escape this unless we are using a linear phase EQ. Now, again, most analog emulations and analog EQs, as well as digital filters, are going to be minimum phase, because you want, minimum phase allows you to work at a very, very low latency, right? So if you're tracking, or if you're working your DAW, you're not going to see tons of latency happening, right? But at the cost of this phase shifting, right? We get that delay that actually causes those, those parts of the phase to shift. So we can't escape this with the analog gear either, right? Or analog filters. So just know that that will still exist regardless of the fact. But again, that's the high pass there. But look what happens when we use the shelf, right? So when we use the shelf and we cut below that frequency, and we kind of move that back as well. So it's kind of replicating a soft slope there for a high pass, but we're not getting the same amount of actual phase shift there. So I would argue to say that the low shelf is a little bit more transparent. So if there's ever a situation where you want to high pass something like a vocal or an instrument or anything like that, I would argue that the low shelf is actually way more transparent and a little bit more forgiving than doing something as aggressive as a high pass, right? If we introduce that high pass again, let's reset that. Boom, we get that phase shift. So again, just something to think about. Again, it's not going to be something that you should really fixate on, but just something to be aware about how EQ can be damaging your music, right? So when you use EQ, especially if you're going very aggressive with the filters, very narrow bands or these very aggressive filter shapes, try linear phase, right? And then if you are going very gradual and soft with your filter shapes, just be understanding of what you're doing to those phases. And again, you really want to remember that it's not always bad. We always just want to be concerned when we are layering instruments, when instruments are in the same frequency zone, like the bass, the low mids, and the mid range, right? And then we also want to be thinking about multi-mic sources and parallel sends and buses, right? That's when we would probably want to use linear phase EQ so we don't cause any discrepancies between either copy. Cool. That's going to wrap it up for today. I hope you got something out of this. I'll see you in the next one. Peace.